Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. English is a curious thing. What exactly is it? How did it come into being? And where might it be headed? This course surveys the history of the English language and the roots of English vocabulary. And over the course of these talks, we will examine how English emerged from a cluster of Germanic dialects in early medieval England, tracing its development from Old English through Middle English and into the modern era. We will also consider how linguistic scholarship in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries has shaped the way we understand ourselves as users of English. Our inquiry will move across social history, literary culture, and vocabulary. At the center of it all, however, lies a fundamental question. What do we actually mean when we speak of the English language? To begin addressing that question, I wish to read several short selections from different historical stages of English. And as you listen, consider how much you can follow and whether you can detect familiar modern words beneath older spellings and pronunciations. The first, Nu schulen hergen, hefen riches werd, meotides mjachtanes modgethunk, werk wuldervater, swachi wunder gewes, etche drichten, ransteelda. Hi schap darn barnum heaven to grofa, halig shippen, va met en gard, monkines werd, etche drichten, efter toda vieren folden frea elmiktig. Was that actually English? What you just heard comes from the Northumbrian variety of Old English, specifically poetry attributed to one Caedmon and dating to around the year 680 AD. Let us now move on to a different sample from the history of the English language. Quandad Aprilam, with his shore sota, the drucht of March hath perced the rota, and bathed every vein in swicht liqueur, of which vertu engendres the flour, on Zephyr zek with his sweete breath, inspired hath in every hult and heth, the tendre croppes, and the jonge sonne hath in the ram his half corseronna, and smale fowles maken melodia, that slepen all the night with open ear, so pricketh hem natura in her courages, van longen folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmerus for to seek and strangest rondes, to fairness always couth and sondre londes, and specially from every shearer's ende of England to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to seek, that him hath holpen, whan that they were sick. Here we hear the well-known opening lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, composed in Middle English toward the close of the 14th century. And after that, to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. These lines are so well known that they scarcely require citation, yet when they are spoken in an approximation of late 16th century pronunciation, the language can sound unfamiliar and even strange. Across all of these examples, you may recognize certain elements, while others feel unfamiliar. In this course, my aim is not merely to chart a straightforward progression from Old English to Middle English to Modern English, but rather to examine how language can be studied historically. In this opening lecture, and in the ones that follow, I will focus on questions and challenges that drive the historical investigation of English. And from there, we will turn to specific texts and historical settings that can shed light on the origins of English, its literary and cultural expressions, and the possible directions it may take in the years ahead. I want to start by raising some broad questions. When we study the history of English, we quickly notice that many of the disputes we encounter today have deep roots in earlier periods. Arguments about language did not arise in a vacuum. They developed within particular historical and social settings. By looking backward, we can better understand current concerns about how language functions in society. One useful place to begin is with the idea of, quote, standard English. Does such a standard exist? And if so, ought there to be a single accepted form of speech and writing, regardless of regional background, social class, or the languages people first learned? Although this may feel like a modern controversy, it is in fact an ancient one. Already in the 10th century, instructors in the church schools of Anglo-Saxon England were wrestling with the same issues. Some argued for fixed norms governing spelling, pronunciation, dialect, and proper usage. As we will explore in later lectures, these same disagreements shaped not only broader theories about language, but also the literary works that have come down to us. Texts such as Beowulf, Caedmon's Hymn, which I just read a moment ago, and other writings from the Old English period emerged from the practices and debates of the medieval scriptorium. During the Middle Ages, particularly in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, similar questions arose about linguistic norms. Should the accepted form of English be modeled on the speech of London, say, or on that of another region? To what extent ought French vocabulary be incorporated at all, if at all? By the 16th and 17th centuries, teachers and language critics were debating whether any emerging standard should be tied to university learning. In the 18th and 19th centuries, these issues were negotiated in classrooms and courtrooms alike, as well as within the official settings of royal, regional, and bureaucratic administration. The case of American English raises the issue of standards once again. Ought a particular regional variety to serve as the model, or should norms be drawn from formal education and scholarly tradition? Once we begin to think about standards, a related set of questions immediately follows, and this will be a major focus of the course, namely, should language be approached in terms of rules that tell us how it ought to be used, or through descriptions of how people actually speak and write? What do these ideas mean in practice? Well, when we examine English or consult a dictionary, we are ostensibly noting aspects like spelling, meaning, pronunciation, and usage. Yet, even in the act of describing, of recording, there is often an element of prescribing. That is to say, when we make statements about English, our words can carry authority if we hold a recognized position, if we speak persuasively, if we are connected to institutions like schools that enforce standards, or have our work widely published. In such cases, a description can quickly assume the force of a rule. In other words, describing language often involves more than simply reporting how it is. It can imply how it ought to be used. And this tension has been a central concern in the study of English. From the Anglo-Saxon period to today, teachers and scholars have wrestled with the question of whether they should actively prescribe linguistic behavior. When we examine the history of dictionaries, we are often seeing the same dynamic at work. Authors, editors, and scholars must balance their task of describing language as they observe it, with the authority they hold to shape or regulate its use. But can anyone truly enforce such a standard? As we will explore in later lectures, dictionary makers known as lexicographers, like Samuel Johnson, whose dictionary of 1755 often serves as a pivotal reference point for both earlier and later lexica, recognized the challenges of capturing English. By the time he completed his work, Johnson understood that English is constantly shifting and fluid, much like a stream or river. As he put it, attempting to, quote, enchain a syllable is almost like trying to tether the wind. Is prescribing language ultimately a futile effort, then? Often, what we attempt to regulate is not just pronunciation or spelling, but aspects of grammar itself. A question I am frequently asked concerns why English grammar seems comparatively simple. By this, people usually mean that, unlike, say, French, German, or other modern European languages, to say nothing of languages further afield. English lacks features such as grammatical gender or case endings, elements that require extensive memorization in traditional grammar instruction. In contrast, studying Latin, for example, which is my day job, I am a Latin teacher in a high school in New York City. By contrast, studying Latin is largely a study of its grammatical system, much to the dismay of my students. English appears to lack these kinds of grammatical features, on the contrary, which raises a key question in its study. How did English evolve from a highly inflected language in the Old English period, with cases, with gender, to the comparatively uninflected language that we use today? This story intersects with many other developments in the language, such as changes in pronunciation and spelling. When we examine grammar and case endings, we are often also observing patterns in spelling, writing, and pronunciation. Many of the debates we will encounter later in the course focus on whether shifts in pronunciation influenced changes in grammar. In other words, did the disappearance of certain sounds lead to the loss of case endings? Did spelling begin to follow established conventions rather than reflecting the way words were actually spoken? In connection between grammar and spelling, the connection rather between grammar and spelling is therefore crucial. And speaking of spelling, when we turn to that itself, anyone who learns English, whether as a child in school or as an adult from another language, quickly encounters its oddities. English contains many letters that are, quote, silent, as well as combinations of consonants or vowels that can change sound depending on the context, making spelling seem unpredictable or inconsistent. Why does English spelling appear so unusual? One goal of this course is to show that English spelling has remained closely tied to history and etymology. In other words, the way words are written often preserves older forms, and we can access that by learning the history of those words. For throughout its history, English speakers and writers have been aware, sometimes deliberately, of the value of maintaining the historical shape of words in their spelling. For example, words like knight, as in a knight in shining armor, one's knee, a knife, or marriage, or the word enough, reflect older pronunciations. In Old English, these words might have been pronounced knicht or knie. In Middle English, knicht and knae were definitely the way that they were pronounced. And marriage appeared in Chaucer's Middle English thoroughly in the French pronunciation, mariage. Nama, in other Middle English texts, would have been the word for name. You would have pronounced the E. And Enuk would have been the pronunciation for enough, just like its German equivalent genug. And we retain that spelling with the GH at the end, even though we no longer pronounce it in that way. What we are observing then is that while pronunciation has shifted over time, spelling often remains fixed. At the same time, some changes in spelling were deliberate. In later lectures, we will examine how 17th and 18th century teachers attempted to regulate spelling based on what they believed to be etymologies. In other words, they respelled words to make them appear more like Latin, even if they had actually entered English through French or another language, and their original spelling would have been different. So words like debt, for instance, which comes from the Latin word debitum, would got its B back into it, even though it didn't have it originally in English. Likewise, the word doubt, which in Latin is dubitum with a B, it got a B reinserted in it as well. And these spellings that we still are familiar with reflect these 18th century pedagogical choices rather than medieval pronunciation patterns. And there are many other examples that we will go over that are like this. In the history of English, then, we observe a gradual divergence between spelling and speech. Over time, spelling became conventional while pronunciation continues to evolve independently. And this raises another question. Why do we pronounce words the way we do? The story of English pronunciation is in large part the story of sound changes. Many of my students ask me, how can we know what Old English sounded like? How did Chaucer or Shakespeare actually pronounce their words? One goal of this course is to explore answers to these questions, but for now, it is worth noting that we have several types of evidence to draw upon. Some of this comes from the way words were spelled, while other sources appear in medieval, Renaissance, and later school books that taught children how to pronounce Latin using their native language. Additional clues can be found in rhyme and poetry. Starting in the 16th century, for instance, scholars also began systematically to document changes in pronunciation, creating what we think of as early forms of phonetic transcriptions. We'll go over all of that. And thanks to this evidence, scholars have been able to reconstruct English pronunciation at various points in its history with a fair degree of accuracy. English has also always varied by region, and one major theme of our course will be the study of regional dialects. From the very beginning, the British Isles had regionally distinct forms of English. Old English, Middle English, and Modern English all exhibited regional variation, just as American English does today. One of the questions we will explore is how scholars reconstruct the sounds of different dialects. We will also consider the relationship between regional varieties and a national standard, and examine how local dialects have influenced the formation of such a standard over time. Just as dialects interact with one another, so too do entire languages. Therefore, another question we will examine is what happens when languages come into contact with one another. For example, the encounter between Old English speakers and French speakers during the Norman conquest had a profound and lasting effect on English, altering its sounds, meanings, vocabulary, idioms, and grammatical structures. Later in the 15th through 18th centuries, English and European explorers encountered speakers of other languages, sometimes the languages of European trade, but sometimes also the non-European languages of colonized peoples, and in both in Asia, in India, for instance, and also in South America and Mesoamerica. New words, therefore, constantly were entering the English language from these other cultures, and with them came shifts in the language's structure and expressions. These changes affected not only vocabulary but also pronunciation. Many of the shifts in English sounds can be traced to contact between different languages and dialects. For instance, the phenomenon known as the Great Vowel Shift of the 15th and early 16th centuries may have been influenced by the mixing of dialects, the decline of French as the prestige language in late medieval England, and the effort of an educated, literate elite to establish a form of pronunciation that would serve as a new standard of prestige, effectively replacing French in that role. When examining language contact, we must also consider translation. Is translation simply a matter of mapping one word onto another, or does it involve something more? A central focus in this course will be the translation of the Bible. Efforts to translate the Bible into the vernacular date back to the Anglo-Saxon period, something rather unique in the history of the European languages to have it go back so old. And what we will learn actually is that English, unlike almost every other European language, has an extremely old vernacular literary tradition, much older than almost anyone else in Europe. When we examine the Bible in particular in Old, Middle, and Modern English, including the King James Bible, we are studying more than translation alone. We are also exploring the phenomenon of archaism, the deliberate use of language to appear old or traditional. This raises questions such as, under what circumstances might a translation intentionally preserve older forms? When can a text provide insight into the history of the language it records? And when does a text reflect not the contemporary speech of its time, but the linguistic practices or teachings of an earlier period? In the case of the King James Bible, we can ask how its highly formal and deliberately archaic English influenced later writers. How did this style shape authors, especially in 19th century America, such as Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Herman Melville, or Joel Chandler Harris, whose Uncle Remus stories draw as much on biblical narrative as on the rhythms and tales of the rural South? The history of English reveals a convergence of texts and a network of influences, a story shaped by language contact. Yet at the same time, it is also a history of our own ways of speaking and of the literature that we read, preserve, and recall. A central argument of this course is that studying the history of the English language, is in many ways also studying the history of our own culture and society. Each of us experiences and imagines ourselves through language. Whether we see language as innate or learned, and whatever we believe about the connection between language and thought or language and society, it remains true that language forms a fundamental medium for personal expression. Many of the texts we will examine in this course revolve around these kind of questions and these sort of themes. To just take an example from something I've already read in this very lecture, the theme of creation is found in Caedmon's hymn, that first text I read from Old English. It contemplates the creation of the world. Chaucer's text that I also quoted, reflects the renewal of life in spring, and Hamlet's famous words that I quoted from his soliloquy in Act 3, Scene 1 of Hamlet, wrestles with the possibility of ending existence altogether, to be or not to be. In each case, language is a tool for creating or uncreating, for shaping our sense of self, and we will explore literary works that show how studying the English language opens a window into the imaginative process of self-creation. Thus, in our course together, my goal is to provide the historical context and broader perspective on English that will allow you to engage with this language in your own life. In doing so, I want to emphasize that the history of English continues to shape how we read, how we speak, and how we experience language today. Many old words have survived, many etymologies remain, and layers of the past are embedded in our speech. I will argue that understanding the history of English is essential for making sense of contemporary debates about language and society. Additionally, we must appreciate the regional diversity of English, whether in America, whether in the British Isles, or elsewhere, to understand the foundations of imaginative storytelling that have shaped writers over the past 1,000 years. The richness and breadth of English is a central focus of this course, and this is not meant as a celebration of the language itself, but because it is hard to say if one language is superior to another. Uh, but I do want to express to you just how profoundly beautiful and how glorious our English language is, and what a great privilege it is to be able to speak it and to read the language, the literature that is written in this language. I want to emphasize that exploring the history of English offers in many ways a way of exploring the history of ourselves. And with all of those themes in mind, we will now pause. In our next lecture, I will introduce some specific analytical methods that will allow us to begin what I like to think of as a journey of discovery, from the Indo-Europeans to the internet, if you like, from Old English to our present day. And along the way, we will gain a deeper appreciation for the vitality, for the richness, and for the expansive scope of the English language. Thank you.